Okay, let's start right at the beginning. Questions that came in almost 4 hours ago. So here we go. Creationist Crybaby is here and has enjoyed this debate. So, questions for TRock and David McQueen. The fossil record shows that modern species did not exist since the beginning of time. Explain why life forms on Earth have continuously changed for as long as there has been life. Whoever would like to start, David or TRock.
I'll go first and let Thomas rest his voice for a moment. What the crybaby puts forward here is incorrect. When he says the fossil record shows that modern species didn't exist since the beginning of time, he's ignoring clams and snails. If you look at certain types of clams and snails, like, for example, a plesiopoid called pecten, which is on the sign for shell oil. Pecten has been the same since what the evolutionists would consider Cretaceous times. And there are other plesiopods that go the range of the whole record. So that part of what Crybaby says is simply not true. Explain why life forms on Earth have continuously changed for as long as there have been life. Well, I think the argument that both Grayson and Thomas gave about the ecological niches shows that Crybaby's wrong. If you're in a niche, for example, a fossil worm like Scolithos, you're happy as a worm burrower and remain happy. So what Crybaby says is simply not true. What do you think, Thomas?
Actually, let's do this. David, that was close to 2 minutes. So let's hand it to Grayson so he can give his thoughts, and then we'll move it back to TRock. So Grayson,
Okay.
Go ahead. I think you're on mute, Grayson.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Creationist Crybaby brings up a good point there. I just want to make just to clarify that there aren't clams at these very old, like they're not classified as clams. They are different. They are like bivalves or brachiopods, but like they're a different genus and species than clams. They are different, actually. The clams that you're talking about in the Cambrian period are different than modern clams. Their shells are a lot thinner. They lack a lot of the features that modern clams have, like specialized filtering mechanisms and gills and the muscular foot that clams have. Their shells are different composition and thickness. So no, the Cambrian clams that you're describing are definitely not modern clams. They are morphologically different. They lack features. They are they're more basal. They're less derived. They're more simple than modern clams, and they're much smaller. So no, they're not the same. You don't have modern species in all the layers. They are different. That's what I was going over with TRock earlier with the whole squirrel thing. They are not modern squirrels. You might find some that could superficially look like some to non-experts, people that maybe just are eyeballing pictures of these things on the internet. But when you actually go and look at the paleontological literature about this, you can see the actual detailed description of these specimens, and you can see how the experts are describing them. You can see which morphological features they lack that make them not the same as modern species.
Okay, Grayson, thank you for the response. TRock, we'll hand it to you.
Donnie, can you share my screen real quick?
You're shared.
Thank you. Yeah, the question, if that could appear up there as well, that would be great. If not, that's fine.
Sure.
I go with this. Continuously changed. Yeah. Does this look any different than the modern form? Not really. Does this one? No. 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 They look extremely similar to the modern forms. So the question is a little bit disingenuous. The word stasis exists in the open literature for a very specific reason. There's not near the amount of change that the question implies there has been, number one. Number two, species. You've got this word, you've got the word species in the comment / question there. What exactly is a species? Now, I'm not trying to give a super technical definition, but generally all you're referring to is the location or the habitat, the specific habitat, and whether or not they interbreed. Now, here is an extremely important point I would like to make in the vein of trying to get other creationists to quit thinking like evolutionists. In the YEC model, people have always been here with the animals. Always. There's so little time where you could say there were animals but not people, specifically Creation Week, and there's so little time there that you can't really, it's meaningless to talk about it in that sense. People have always been here. People have always influenced the movement of the biota in the world. Always. All of written history declares this. There are a host of reasons, and I can barely probably scratch the surface, but a higher level glance, there are a host of reasons why people do this, and it directly influences the changes that we do see. For example, people transport animals around the world, fish, aquatic animals as well, not just land animals, not just land plants. They transport the biota around the globe for the sake of agriculture, commerce, war, art. I could go on and on. There are a bunch of reasons why people do this, and it has a direct impact on what you call a species. If you were not there when a 10-year-old said, "Daddy, can I take this rabbit with us on our trip?" or a group of rabbits, as it were, and you didn't see that happen, and they take this rabbit on some long, or say a couple of rabbits on a long trip, and they end up leaving them there, and they interbreed with another group of rabbits. In the scientific world, you would have, if you didn't know the presence of people were there, you would call those two different populations of rabbits different species. To the creationists, they're still just rabbits. They still interbreed. Just because you didn't see how the populations mixed does not mean that they were stuck all on their own to figure it out all on their own by very gradually moving their habitat until they finally got into connection with each other. When people are present, the dynamics of everything changes. So I'll stop there.
You're on mute.
Yeah, I was on mute. Thank you. Okay, so thank you, TRock. Before we hand it to David, Grayson, if there's anything you'd like to respond to there or anything you'd like to add, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, none of that explains why. Like, he's just saying basically they're all the same species, even though they look different. We just call them different species because, like, that's how we classify them. But if that were the case, like, he still has to explain why we don't find any of the Cambrian clam-looking things in the modern world. We don't find any of these species. In fact, we only find them in the Cambrian layers. So, you know, that there's still, the fossil record needs to be explained. That's what I've been harping on all debate.
Grayson, appreciate it. Question was for team David and TRock. So David, we're going to give you the last word. Go ahead.
I do not think that when the Bible talks about a fruit tree reproducing by its kind, it's talking at the species level. I think that the biblical use of the word kind for something like a gastropod or a plesiopod is at the family level. For other things like a dinosaur or a dog, it's at the genus level. And so when we return to this debate in late summer or early fall, we need to focus on some of these issues, like are all of these gastropods? They are. Okay, Donnie, thank you.
And moving on to a question for TRock, coming in from Creationist Crybaby. So CC's coming at you, TRock, and he's asking, explain how several radiometric dating methods of meteorites and the oldest Earth rocks give ages over 4 billion years.
I think I've already fairly thoroughly explained this. Two alternatives exist. Either you assume that 100% of the daughter isotope came from radiometric decay, or you don't assume that and you don't have a dating method. They give these alleged ages of 4+ billion years because that's the ratios that they exist in. But that is still just question begging. You haven't explained how you know 100% of the daughter isotope came from radiometric decay. And I'm saying a far more logical explanation in standard physics is the process that created the parent isotope also created X amount of the daughter isotope at the same time.
Appreciate it, TRock. Mark, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so this is sort of just a wild speculation. We do see rocks form, like igneous rocks and metamorphic rocks. We have seen them form on Earth at much younger ages, so we can sort of evaluate how much of the parent element is in there. But you're saying, so TRock saying, well, there's more of the daughter element in there, but he hasn't got any basis for that. Things like potassium argon, as I pointed out, we know it contains no argon because argon's a gas. So our samples collected from the very deep inside, we know has to have come there through radioactive decay because argon does not appear like that in recent examples. So this whole idea, this premise that he's like, well, we don't know the daughter element. No, we kind of do. And that's just sort of science denial again by TRock.
Thank you, Mark. TRock, you get the last word. Question was for you.
Yeah, that was not science denial. What Mark described was the formation of an igneous rock, not the origin of the elements that comprise the igneous rock. Those are two different things. And so he's not really broached the subject of where did the elements, the first appearance of those elements come from. Nobody knows. It's entirely speculation how the Earth formed, and it defies physics anyway. You can't get a rocky body formed the way the Earth is by dust flying through outer space until it finally coalesces and a star explodes, and then you get star debris flying through space until finally enough of that collects around another star that hasn't yet exploded until it finally gravitationally collapses on itself and forms a planet. None of that is science. It's all 100% speculation. And as far as Mark's comments on the presence of or lack of argon in modern samples, no. Go get some modern igneous rocks that you know. For example, in Hawaii, their volcano there, Iceland. Where am I thinking of? Is it Iceland? They had a volcanic activity here fairly recently. Anyway, go get any one of those recent deals. You'll find argon in the lava flows and in the ash. It'll be there, and that's been a main problem. One of the things that many modern or many 21st century scientists have done is ignored taking those control samples and looking for it. They've just assumed that argon escapes so quick that it can't be there except by radiometric decay, but modern volcanic activity shows the exact opposite.
Creationist Crybaby, question for TRock. TRock, why aren't a single mammal, bird, dinosaur, or flowering plant found fossilized in any rocks of the Grand Canyon?
It's a totally fair question, but you also got to ask, in a global flood, why do you think they should be there? I kind of asked this question during the debate. I have never heard a reasonable response, and when I say reasonable, I mean let's use some real-time physics, some real-time geophysical scaling, and try and answer some of those questions. And I'm not trying to deflect here, but there is a serious problem there. Why do you think they should be there? So if you're an evolutionist, you need to go work on that, come back with a good answer, not some of the stuff that I've heard in the past. But anyway, to answer this question more directly, why don't we? It's because, again, ecological zonation. I kind of alluded to this earlier. What's actually happened in most of the Western U.S. is because that is the direction that the continent moved in both the evolutionary paradigm and in the young Earth paradigm. That's the direction it moved. What I was describing earlier during the conversation was that the North American continent was basically, it was kind of gliding across the seafloor like this. And what actually happens, and this is good, this will give people, creationists, a lot of good research material. But what actually happens is, I'm going to try and get back in front of the camera here, sorry. What actually happens is, as that continent is moving, let's say here's the seafloor down here and the continent's moving across, what it's doing is shoveling up and creating kind of a hydrofoil. And that's easily described through physical bench testing. You create kind of a hydrofoil, the water comes up and it starts flowing in laminar form over the continent as the continent is moving. So it's not just water moving, it's not just the continent moving, it's both moving relative to each other. And when you get that hydrofoil, what you're seeing is scooping up the seafloor and dragging it across and depositing it on top of the continent. When that happens, there is no reason why anything on land, as far as land animals, birds, you got mammals and flowering plants, all that, there is no reason why anything on land should yet be in that sediment. It won't be there yet. It hasn't been out there long enough yet. So kind of the extension of that question is the dinosaur fossils that we do find, for example, since they're a hot, popular topic, basically what's happened with those are the ones that have died way offshore, had a lot of time to deteriorate. And by a lot of time, you just got to keep in mind, deterioration happens really quickly in the real world. They deteriorate over some number of weeks or months. And then by that time, they're settled down. And then that's how long it takes for the continent to catch up with where they died at, scoop them up and put them on top of what you call Cambrian sediments. So that's your answer. It's scooping up literally off the ocean floor and bringing it up over a period of time and over vast distances as well, but through a very rapid process.
Okay, TRock, thank you for the response. Mark, I'm sure you're dying to respond. And in our Q&As, we do give both debaters the opportunity to respond to each question. We'll just make sure whoever the question is for gets the last word. Therefore, Mark, floor is yours.
All right. Well, what TRock said there's not accurate. He doesn't understand the layers of the Grand Canyon. But like, for example, when it comes to flowering plants, I think what Creationist Cryberry is referring to when it comes to flowering plants is that flowering plants create something called pollen. And pollen is actually found all over the globe. So we find pollen in ocean sediment, glacial ice, dry land sediments, everywhere. So in the rocks that predate Devonian, so for example, the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, maybe the very end of Silurian, you're not going to find any, not even a single pollen grain in those rocks. Why? Because land plants didn't exist on the planet. If there's land plants, you're going to have pollen grains. You're going to have remnants of plant life on land. You cannot avoid it. It gets up into the atmosphere. It gets deposited all through the oceans. It's all over the place. Can't avoid it anywhere on planet Earth. So if there's no pollen, no seeds, no leaves, no traces of any type of vegetation, they didn't exist on dry land. And there's an actual hard cutoff in the fossil record for when we know land plants first evolved onto land. So one other thing, though, that's pretty interesting there, he says, why aren't there any single mammals? With some of the layers there within the Grand Canyon prove that the Colorado Plateau was actually a desert very similar to the Sahara Desert. We actually have those sand dunes fossilized within the rocks. We even know the direction of the wind. We know where the sand dunes were blowing. It's preserved within the rock. And in those desert rocks, completely antithesis of whatever flood that TRock says, there's actually something called trace fossils within those rocks of reptiles. Now, we don't have an actual fossil of the reptile,
But in those fossil layers, we do have some trace fossils of reptiles. No signs of any type of marine life, because at that time the Colorado Plateau was a desert that resembled the Sahara Desert today. Good question.
Thank you, Mark, for the response. TRock, question was for you. You can have the last response. Go ahead.
So the whole pollen argument, it actually is interesting, and it represents one of the better arguments that somebody could make. But there's still a very reasonable explanation for why you don't find pollen in the Cambrian, nor should you. Say again.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So that is, if you actually read the Bible, you find out that the flood started at the very beginning of the new year, which was spring. The Jewish calendar starts in spring, not January, so it's much more akin to April. But because it starts very early in the year, there's not a whole lot of pollen in the world yet, because pollen's developed throughout the springtime. The other thing you have to note, though, that is
That's not
pollen.
true. Not along the equator, not in the warmer climates. That's only in the northern latitudes.
Are you done yet? No. Okay, so pollen gets recycled very quickly in the biological world. It's eaten by some animals, or by animals, I mean very generically speaking. Different insects consume it. Different things happen to it. It basically, when you have a pollen storm in the summer, or in the late spring or whatever, it doesn't last very long. It gets cleaned up rather quickly. But here we are at the beginning of spring, and it's lasted. Mark, can you be quiet?
Sorry.
But pollen gets consumed very quickly, and we're at the beginning of spring, so you've had most of the year for the vast majority of the pollen to have already been recycled by the biota. Furthermore, there is a formation in South America called the Roraima Formation, and it has pollen grains in rocks that are alleged to be over 1 billion years old. It's completely ignored in the literature by and large. You've got a few commentaries that say, well, it doesn't really look, it looks like contamination or something to that effect, but it's there, and getting pollen into igneous rocks, as it were, not something you could contaminate an igneous rock with. So yeah, there's no particular reason to expect pollen to be all over the planet during a global flood.
Okay, another one for TRock. Creationist Crybaby coming at you again. And the question is, TRock, explain how fossil organisms are found with other fossils from coherent ecosystems, not transported / mixed with fossils from different environments.
The form of the question is just super general and vague, so it's kind of hard to give a concise answer to something like that. But explain how fossil organisms are found with other fossils from coherent ecosystems, not transported or mixed with fossils from different environments. So the question alludes to the idea that in a global flood, you should be mixing ecosystems, and that's not necessarily true at all. And the reason it's not true is because water is essentially incompressible. And what that means is if you've got two different bodies floating in the water at any given time, if their densities are very similar to each other and their buoyancy is very similar, when a wave comes along, it pushes them both along together. The Earth is 200 million square miles of surface area, of which today's oceans have somewhere around 140 million square miles of surface area. And there's so much vast distance to try and get, and I'm describing things that are floating, but there's so much vast distance to cross in incompressible water to get the bodies to come together. If the flood sequence happens fast, there's nowhere near enough time to get them together, first of all. Second of all, if we're talking about things that have sunk to the bottom, they're still in water, and water is still incompressible. So any waveforms that move sediments on the bottom, whether they're mechanical from underneath or whether they're actual water movement. The water's still incompressible and you still move them kind of along at the same rate. And again, if the flood happens fast, and it did, there's not enough time to shove one ecosystem into another and get them to blend up. That would look more like a hurricane. But when large bodies of water, very large bodies of water, have nothing interrupting them directly, you can't get that swirled, mixed up, turbulent flow very easy at all. That always happens out at the boundaries. You don't have to do much more than stand at the edge of a river or creek and see the difference in the smooth flow of the riverbed and then the eddies on the side where things are more turbulent. It has to have something to interrupt it to create that swirling motion. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. The Earth is too big, water is incompressible, and there's not enough time to mix them like that in that large of an environment.
TRock, appreciate it. Mark, floor is yours.
Well, compression of water has nothing to do with it. We see floods all the time that still happen today. And the main thing is you can't form a rock or anything while it's still submerged in water. I'm sure even TRock would agree with that. And once that flood water recedes, you have, let's say the flood lasted, we have floods from tsunamis and so forth, they'll last days. Once that flood water recedes, everything that died is going to be left on the land. And there's no way that you can tell me, looking at that pile of carnage, who died, who drowned immediately, and who made it to the very end and was able to keep their head above water. They die. They're all on the ground in a pile of death. So he asks a very good question. And if you're looking at the geologic column in the fossil record, this is something probably that creationists don't really understand, is that if you were to, and a great analogy I use, guys, is let's say you just break down the fossil record into a 100-story building. So the first floor would be the first fossils that were deposited, obviously. And then the 100th floor would be the last fossils deposited. So if you're going up this elevator on our building of fossils, for the first 83 floors, all you would see are single-celled marine organisms. That's all. On the 84th floor, you'd finally see multicellular marine fossils. But marine fossils, no life on land. It wouldn't be until the 89th floor where you'd finally find life on land, but no trees, no flowering plants, no reptiles, no mammals, no birds, no dinosaurs, just primitive fungus, arthropods and amphibians. By the 94th floor, dinosaurs finally make their appearance. 96th floor, you finally get some fossils of mammals, not the ones that are alive today, but you start seeing mammals on the 96th floor. 98th floor, whale fossils finally come into the picture. And it's not until the very top of the 100th floor toward the ceiling is where you start seeing any of the animals that would possibly be alive today, like, primitive humans and mammals. Nothing that creationists believe was on the ark is found in the fossil record, the exact matches for that, because they didn't exist back then. So it's a pretty good breakdown of and the reason why, to answer the question is why, explained for different organisms are found in different layers, is because animals lived at different times during the Earth's history. You just didn't have everything sitting in a pile of death after the flood waters receded. And, there's technically 2 flood stories in Genesis. All Jews know this because we read the Torah in Hebrew. You guys should probably try to do like TRock, learn Hebrew. There's 2 flood stories. There's 2 creation stories in Genesis 1. Between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3, there's two creation stories, and there's 2 flood stories if you actually read Genesis. So you'd have to kind of determine on which one of those stories it's either the flood lasted a year or 150 days. But regardless, after that 150 days, all you're going to have is just a pile of carnage at the end when that water recedes. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mark. And TRock, question was for you. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mark's equivocating again. I pointed this out in my first response that turbulent flow where you do mix things happens at the boundary zones, and he's equivocating a local catastrophe with a worldwide flood. A local catastrophe has very close proximity boundary zones to it, so you get a lot of turbulence. You can mix things, and by very definition of local catastrophe, you expect everything in that ecosystem to be together. And so, yeah, you're going to have to learn to separate the difference between the evolutionary viewpoint and the creationist viewpoint, and separate the difference in the physical sizes of the comparisons you're trying to make there. It's vastly different scales with vastly different expectations. But probably, if you're a biologist listening, here's one of the major complaints I have with Mark's assessment that the fossils represent different times throughout a very deep geological history. And that is that in the evolutionary paradigm, there is, for hundreds of millions of years, there's never a complete ecosystem until you finally get some plants and some land animals way down the road in the process. And the problem with that is that the ecosystem we have today works because it takes all of the biota in the world to contribute to the recycling process. And so basically what that means is if you subscribe to the evolutionary paradigm, you've got this long period of time where you have marine animals and no plant life. The problem is you don't have a complete recycling system. Without a complete recycling system, you get a bunch of trash and garbage piling up that living organisms cannot survive in. You need all of it to work together globally. It's just insane to me that anybody can imagine 100 million years worth of time without a complete biodome in place.